Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. First of all, I would like to thank President Song Jung-gok and STEPI for inviting me to this very important occasion, and to add my own congratulations to STEPI's 30th anniversary. At the time STEPI was founded, I was just becoming director of a first cousin institute, Prest in the United Kingdom, now the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research, and we have had some really excellent exchanges around policy and the study of innovation over those 30 years, and I hope they will long continue. So let me come to my topic. I'm going to be talking about innovation ecosystems and how they give us a way of thinking in policy design. You already heard our very distinguished speakers during the opening ceremony using this terminology of the ecosystem. It is now very common across the discourse of policy and of business, and increasingly in academia. This was not the case around the year 2000, so it is something new. So I would like to take us on a voyage through this topic. So let me begin with the original paradigm. In the post-World War II era, there were long-term structures which exist where innovation was largely driven by self-sufficient major companies, corporate R&D based, who benefited from the public science system largely as a public good. That was the model for knowledge flows. From the 1980s, the governance of innovation began to change. Through cost pressures, rapid pace of change in critical technologies, and also a change in the politics of science, where government started to demand evidence of the contribution to socio-economic goals, the system became much more externalized and transactional, sometimes called the new public management approach. Policy thinking followed on from this, and we saw at that time the emergence of the concept of innovation systems from some giants of our field, Lundvall, Chris Freeman, Charles Edquist, and OECD was indeed a major vector in spreading this way of thinking. Policies began to change. They began to focus much more on collaboration. Most new initiatives were collaborative across business and the public science sector. By the time we got to the early 2000s, this had crystallized into two new concepts. One of these, very familiar to people here, I'm sure, was what we now call open innovation, made popular by Henry Chesbrough, and the other, what I will talk about, innovation ecosystems. So what was going on that caused this change? In the very early 2000s, I was privileged to be asked by one group of firms to do a world tour with a couple of colleagues to visit several major companies and to ask them what was going on, what was moving in the world of R&D and innovation for business. And this study was eventually summarized in an article in Science, A New Industrial Ecology, a very early usage of the ecosystem analogy. So what we found were that there were typically large multi-product, multi-technology firms surrounded by a dynamic population of smaller companies who were sustained by venture capital. We were seeing quite a dynamic system going on, complex patterns of birth, growth, and acquisition, firms being founded, firms closing, dying, allowing technologies to be selected in a much more evolutionary way. R&D was less the creature of these large establishments, much more likely to be outsourced to specialist organizations, to universities. We were seeing networks and alliances being built around these generic technologies, at that time the dominant one, of course, being information and communication technologies, also building standards and supply chains. R&D was also globalizing, and local capabilities in people and scientific institutions became major attractors for R&D. There was an early awareness of the importance of lead markets as somewhere where you could try out a technology and then build a pattern of adaptation. So these were the starting conditions of where we are today. Why then do we need to describe it as a concept? What in what I've just said is different from what we now term open innovation? The classic definition of open innovation is largely about the use and provision of external ideas by firms to improve their success in innovation, and of course what you need to do to achieve that. If we look at the innovation ecosystem, it of course encompasses what I've just described as open innovation. It also draws importantly upon the core concept of the innovation systems approach, which was a focus on institutions. But where it takes off from that is a focus on the dynamics of the wider environment in which innovation takes place. It is about understanding these dynamics, the flows and interdependencies at a systemic level. In 2008, I had the privilege to chair a review panel for the European Commission, which was redefining what they term the European research area, trying to find a new rationale for it. And at that time, we found this system, this way of thinking, was very helpful to what we were doing. So if you begin to think of innovation as an ecology, it focuses your mind on the distribution and abundance of research performers and knowledge and their interactions with each other and the broader environment. So there are some very clearly biological analogies, but of course you shouldn't take a metaphor too far. We must keep our eyes very clearly on what is really happening in the world of innovation itself. Now, what was core to these dynamics were what I will call the four flows of the innovation ecosystem. The mobility of people, the skills and talents that need to move around, often starting in the education system, building critical mass in labor markets for new technologies, offering pathways for creative people. A second mobility is the mobility of money, of finance. An innovation system cannot function unless there is sufficiently mobile circulation of capital and complementary public investment in key infrastructures. The third kind of mobility is slightly different and links very strongly to the original innovation systems concept, mobility in the services that you offer to support innovation. We have evolved quite dramatically over the last decade what we understand by incubators, science parks. New terms emerge such as accelerators. We understand the need for digital connectivity, various types of business support, measurement and testing services, and so on. And they are a key part of any innovation system. Lastly, we come to the flows of knowledge itself. Innovation is crucially about knowledge, and if knowledge does not move, either in formal ways through the intellectual property system or in informal ways through interactions, we are very unlikely to have an innovative environment. Where do these flows go? I will offer you a diagram, which is probably not too easily readable on the slide. This has a story. Our Parliament has a committee on science and technology, and in the previous Parliament they carried out a landmark inquiry which they called Bridging the Valley of Death, trying to understand why we were not matching expectations from science and technology in innovation. They were very much caught in this linear model approach of this valley of death. But as they progressed in the inquiry, and partly through taking evidence from people in science and innovation studies, they came to realize that the ecosystem approach was a better metaphor for what they were doing. And when they came to write their report, they wanted to put in a section on it. What happened was the day before Christmas in 2012, I got a telephone call at home from the secretary of the committee saying, "Can you recommend a good diagram of an innovation ecosystem? We've looked on the internet and we can't find any that we like." Well, I said, "I would agree with you. There aren't any good ones." They said, "That's fine. Can you draw us one, and can we have it by the day after Christmas? Because we're working right through to produce this report." So this is a Christmas Day product of a simplified schematic of an innovation ecosystem. It's stylized, of course, and particularly adapted to the UK case. But I think what is important to note in it is that it does map all of these flows and show that eventually we have a kind of circular economy in innovation. Oops, excuse me. Now I'm going to jump to some much more recent work, a research project I'm carrying out with a number of European colleagues, coordinated by Aalto University and supported by the European Commission Horizon 2020 programme, called Industrial Innovation in Transition. This project, which is approaching its end, has looked at industrial innovation and changes in the past 10 years across 5 sectors in 11 European countries. And our central instrument has been an in-depth interviews carried out with quite a substantial number of companies, almost 700, typically 2 hours each, and subsequently coded for quantitative and qualitative analysis. And one of the key aspects we were investigating was how companies perceive and behave and manage their innovation ecosystem. I will draw on a few results from this in the following slides. So let me first put up a slide which was almost not worth bothering with because the numbers are so extreme. But if you ask companies the basic question, is the innovation ecosystem concept relevant for your innovation activities? Overwhelmingly, in all of the 5 sectors, very slightly less in agri-food from the others, companies will agree that it's relevant. I didn't put up the other number that goes with it. They believe it has become much more relevant in the past 5 years. So it's a moving concept for them. So if we accept that there is something in this idea of an innovation ecosystem, what does that mean for innovation policy? It seems to me that it opens up a number of questions that we don't always ask. Carrying on with our analogy about being interested in populations, we can ask whether we have the right population of actors in an innovation ecosystem. Does a country or region have a proper balance between large multi-product, multi-technology firms who are the system integrators or anchors, or compared with the surrounding populations of smaller companies working in the venture capital territory, feeding them with innovative ideas and products? What happens to the much larger population of established small and medium-sized companies? How do we make more of them innovative? 2 years ago, I was invited by the Spanish government to head a peer review of their own national research and innovation system. We did quite a detailed study of it. And one of our principal conclusions was just in this population idea. There were some very good innovative companies in Spain, but first of all, they lacked integrators. They had fewer than 10 companies that would meet that description. And more importantly, the total population of innovative companies was too small. So however much you charged up the knowledge system, unless you increased that population of companies, you are unlikely to have a successful innovation policy. The concept also drives us to ask whether the ecosystem looks different in different sectors. Why could it be different? Is it to do with the nature of the technology? Is it to do with the market conditions? Or are we simply locked in by historic drivers? A second core question, and very, very close to my own research interests, is looking at the demand side, asking whether an innovation system has sufficient pull-through, demand for innovation in the system. Is public procurement properly doing its job? Are private procurers in your economy sufficiently capable to specify and stimulate innovative companies and drive demand for innovation? We can also look at wider demand-side issues in terms of the standards and regulations. It could be that new solutions are crowded out by a lock-in to existing standards, regulations, and structures. We asked the companies in our survey what they considered to be the most important elements of the ecosystem. And if you'd asked me to guess in advance, I would have expected that they would have put money and people first. But in all of the sectors, they put knowledge much more highly rated. They recognized all of the elements, they gave them support, but knowledge flows appeared to be the greatest concern. And here we were talking typically at chief executives of smaller firms, vice presidents of larger firms. So we were not just talking about knowledge workers within the companies. If we then look at these individual elements, on each of these slides, I've put in italics at the top a quote from one of the interviewed companies, just to give you a feel for the kind of information that was coming in. So clearly finance is a challenge, particularly for smaller companies. This one is saying it's far and away the most difficult thing for them because they have a long-term development horizon, and most external financiers don't like funding long-term development. So for these younger and growing firms, it was a real constraint. If we take this to a policy level, it's very rarely the case that a government decides how much public support it should give to research and innovation on any rational basis, on the basis of a calculation of the aggregate social returns to the economy. Now, some would consider that capital markets also systematically underestimate the returns from innovation. If that's the case, we might see company managements responding and underestimating the returns and therefore under-investing in innovation. There is clearly a risk here. That would mean that ecosystems are typically running suboptimally in terms of available finance at key points. Now, this is absolute heresy to a free market economist who would expect that these things should naturally balance themselves out. But it's certainly not the view of people you find on the front line in companies. I mean, I was talking recently to a very senior manager in a global major that had just fought off a takeover bid from a predatory company, and they were finding downward pressure on their innovation spending, although every rational thought would tell them that the future of the company lay in increasing innovation spending and improving their product portfolio. So what's the policy challenge here then is to design measures which increase the rewards to those investing in innovation and trying to connect private and social benefits back to the source of investment. Moving then to the second flow, the flow of people. This is intimately connected with one of the most useful concepts that we have in innovation policy studies, thanks to Cohen and Leventhal, the concept of absorptive capacity. So we heard from a number of companies that getting the right people was a major challenge for them, especially people who came with the knowledge that the company needed. So if we go back to the example of the Spanish companies that were not being innovative, they didn't have the absorptive capacity to work properly with the science system in Spain. And this was a people problem. It is, of course, also determined by the routines in those firms, whether they've designed their routines to be able to scan and capture external knowledge. But in the end, if you don't have people who understand the world of technology and the world of technological markets, you're not going to be able to make use of that information. So there's a systemic policy dimension in looking at the necessary future requirements, the population of skills. We have huge skills challenges in the area that Douglas was just talking about. People in machine learning get recruited before universities can finish training them, and there are none left to teach anybody else about it as a result. We also need the kind of policy which encourages recruitment of these skills into deficient firms. There is a family of innovation policies which put researchers into companies, usually young, maybe doctoral or even master's level researchers. They keep their links with their original university or institute, and very normally they're retained by the company which embarks on an innovative path. Of course, the whole mobility problem in innovation is also an issue. We know of celebrated areas such as Silicon Valley, where people move in and out of companies very quickly. They take knowledge and skills with them. They create a dynamism. That, globally speaking, that is absolutely not the case. The turnover of people in the world of innovation is lower than it should be. I come now to services, the role of intermediaries. This is too long a quote to read out, but this is a company saying, we're a small company, somebody out there, please help us. So what are these services? Innovation and business support agencies, private professional services, the whole infrastructure around intellectual property, professional technical services, testing and measurement, design and creating services. Now, all of these mediating structures exist both with public support and in the private sector market, and they exist to de-risk innovation. But it is quite difficult to fine-tune these systems to the needs of emerging sectors. I'm glad I put the last point on there about data infrastructure, because this connects very much to what Douglas was saying. It's typically neglected. It occurs in many ways. We, of course, think of the physical network infrastructure, but the data infrastructure of people is also a key constraint here. Lastly, of the four, I come to knowledge flows and to ask whether they're working sufficiently well. A lot of the driving of knowledge flows comes from connections, bringing the right kind of organizations together. Of course, we already knew this. We didn't need the concept of innovation ecosystems to tell us. We have had decades of policy targeting science industry links. Actually, that is understating it. I did a review of reviews of university industry links in the United Kingdom, and the first one I found was in the year 1901, which was reported in an editorial in the Times, which said that men of science are not connecting properly with men of work. It was all men in those days, I'm afraid. And they do it a lot less well than the Germans do it. So that maybe hasn't changed. So it was also featured in the works of Alfred Marshall, the great economist of the 1920s. It goes on and on. I mean, I don't know whether other countries are in the same situation. We seem to have a review of university-industry relations approximately every 2 years nowadays. Less visible are the natural flows of knowledge between companies, particularly the vertical flows between customers and suppliers. This is often an invisible area for innovation policy design. There are some initiatives which have targeted supply chains. There are a number of pilot initiatives looking at using public procurement to provide demand pull for innovation, but all of them are relatively small scale. We need a close look here at what's working and a very significant scaling up. This also leads us to what has become a partly hidden area for innovation policy, and that is the area of diffusion of technology. We've become very interested in where the leading edge lies and less interested in what's happening in the following companies. Of course, governments have outreach schemes, but these need to work a lot more quickly and a lot more effectively. This underpins the productivity challenge, certainly for European countries. I mean, even in the USA, in any given sector, the top decile of companies in that sector will typically be twice as productive as the bottom decile. So what can we do about those gradients? Can we address them through innovation and diffusion policies? Where then does this leave us in terms of challenges and opportunities? There are potentially barriers to these flows in the ecosystem. The intellectual property system is under strain. It exists not only to protect, reward, and incentivize inventors, but also to help knowledge circulate. But in practice, some trends, for example, the existence of patent trolls, are inhibiting the movement of knowledge. In the world of science, we have the open science movement, so positive in many ways, and an instrument to accelerate knowledge flows and take them out of the hands of a narrow group of publishing houses. But there's a certain paradox here that the more freely knowledge is available, the more likely it is to need an additional system for validation and certification of that knowledge. And the extreme case of that is the phenomenon of fake news, which we're now confronted with. But we can see it on a lesser scale in the production of knowledge for innovation as well. In the area of finance of innovation, you can observe that there are clear economies of scale. A company going into a large market with a particular innovation has an advantage over a company going into a small market with the same innovation. That increases its value. It becomes more investable. The consequence of that is that venture capital systems, notably in the USA, work typically 7 to 10 times larger in their scale of activity. It also allows them to specialize and develop greater expertise, so it's a virtuous circle for them where they can make more effective investments. So there are these advantages to large countries, and I think we see in a different way similar advantages in China. In the people dimension, the flow of people, particularly the cross-border flow of people, has proved critical to many innovation ecosystems. And yet this is often juxtaposed with pressures on migration, with concerns about unemployment. And to me, this poses in several parts of the world a threat, not least in my own country, to the innovation ecosystem. We also have some emerging opportunities. If we take a proactive approach to ecosystem development, it gives us a way to address one of the most difficult problems of innovation, which is how to bring it to lagging regions. There's a very natural formation of ecosystems in the top regions. Can we unpick the concept enough that we can start to try to build these elements more systematically where they do not currently exist, or at least where there is a low base rather than a high base? It also gives us an opportunity to deal more systematically with transitions. It would be impossible to move to a properly working electric vehicle infrastructure without either consciously or unconsciously applying an ecosystem concept and understanding that there are many elements which need to move together if we are to achieve that kind of transition. So if we take this concept as being something that's with us, it changes the way that we might approach the governance of innovation ecosystems. The boundaries, first of all, are less clear than the conventional innovation systems approach, which normally has another word in front of it: national, regional, sectoral, and clear terms of reference. So where do policymakers sit in an ecosystem approach? I believe that the one place they do not sit is up on a mountain, Mount Olympus perhaps, looking down and being able to see all the players and say, let's move this one, let's a bit more of that, a bit less of the others. Actually, they are players in the system. They are down there among the others, and certainly they need to apply instruments which are aiming to adjust the balance, to enhance and moderate these flows, but it's unlikely that you could do it on a purely theory-driven basis. It's quite an old insight. In fact, with my colleague Stan Metcalf, I had an article on this in the OECD STI Review, an excellent journal, which is no longer with us, I believe, but where we argued that ultimately innovation policy is best dealt with on an evolutionary and experimental approach. You try something out. If it works, you grow it. If it doesn't work, you drop it. So finally, let me come to future policy needs and try to summarize where we've got to. The emphasis on knowledge flows, as I have stressed, places a focus on the balance of actors and the vectors of knowledge transfer. So it means a population approach to innovation policy. We've also seen the importance of customers and suppliers, but I think a neglect at trying to work more systematically with supply chains, the most natural influence upon companies. When we come to a new technology where a supply chain is not there, the onus is on the public body to help to create new demand channels. This places a focus on procurement and lead market approaches. This is a very common deficiency in ecosystems. We all scrabble to attract into our regions or into our countries the kind of anchor firms who could drive demand, but actually the supply of these anchor firms is diminishing. They're typically merging, consolidating, and we need to look for alternative ways to carry out that function. Not all innovation is leading to a market outcome. We very clearly need socially driven innovation. We face a number of critical societal challenges in the area of sustainability, in the area of air quality, some non-market dimensions of health, certainly the challenges coming from the aging society. So we also need to ensure that those demand channels are designed and work effectively for these socially driven innovation areas. And I thought, since we are visiting and the guests of STEPI, who have made such a major contribution to the world of foresight, it would be appropriate to finish with the need to say that you always have to be looking forward, and an absolutely key system, not only for trying to see where you're going, but for generating the kind of coordination I have been talking about. We absolutely need to harness the tools of foresight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for especially